Hey there everyone, my name's Dylan, and it seems like these days every Hearthstone content creator on YouTube is doing custom card reviews. That definitely seems to be the in thing right now, and I thought let's get in on some of that action. But instead of just firing up the custom Hearthstone subreddit and seeing what they've got to offer, I thought hey, let's do a little bit more work than that. No shots fired. If you've ever come out and checked out my stream on Twitch, you'll probably know that I love Hearthstone, but I also love Magic the Gathering. And Magic the Gathering has had a lot more time to develop really complex rules and some really interesting card designs. So I thought, hey, wouldn't it be fun to take some cards from Magic the Gathering and try and adapt them into Hearthstone using the sort of Hearthstone ethos and the rules and mechanics that Hearthstone currently has. So today I've got 5 cards, one of each of Magic the Gathering's colours of mana, and we'll look through them, and if this series proves popular, maybe we'll do some more. So to kick things off today, we have one of the most iconic creatures in Magic the Gathering's history, Shivan Dragon. Now this card was in the very first set of Magic the Gathering in Alpha, and it's been reprinted quite a lot since then. So it often is used to introduce people to the game. The 6 mana 5/5 flying creature with this pretty powerful ability, commonly called Fire Breathing, where you get to pay a red mana to give it 1 more attack. It's seen as like a bit of a bomb when you're starting out in Magic the Gathering. You know, you're playing with your dirty little creatures, and then someone busts out this big ass dragon, and you're like, wow, that dragon's powerful. Turns out the card is actually competitively not that good. 6 mana 5/5 is not that fantastic of a rate. It tends to get outclassed, especially by more modern creature design. Even back in the day, it was outclassed by a lot of other non-creature spells, which were just a lot more powerful back then. Now here's what I think it would look like in Hearthstone, or at the very least how I might design it for Hearthstone. The first thing you'll notice is that flying obviously doesn't appear. Flying is an ability that works really well in the context of Magic the Gathering because its combat system is so different. It basically gives the defending player more control over combat, and flying is a way to give your creature what we call evasion, to try and allow that creature to punch through and kind of offset that advantage that the defending player has. In Hearthstone that doesn't make any sense because the attacking player has a lot more control than the defending player. So flying is out of the picture, but we've still got that fire breathing ability to look at, and that's definitely the most iconic part of Shivan Dragon. The way that this ability normally works in Magic the Gathering is that it's an activated ability, which is something that Hearthstone doesn't really have. We'll come on to that a bit later, I think, as well. The way that this ability works in Magic the Gathering is that it's an activated ability, something that Hearthstone doesn't really have, which ends up being a bit of a problem when you're trying to adapt these cards. So normally in Magic the Gathering, you swing with your creature, your opponent says that they're not blocking, they're not removing it with a removal spell, and then you choose how much mana you want to pump into this to make it stronger to attack your opponent for more. But in lieu of activated abilities, at least Hearthstone's combat system is a lot more flexible. You can attack, then play cards, then attack, whereas in Magic you kind of have to do one then the other. So what I thought might be quite fun is if Shivan Dragon, when it attacks in Hearthstone, it just automatically spends all of your mana and pumps itself until the end of the turn, otherwise it would be a bit too crazy. I think this works out pretty well because in Magic you're going to usually spend all of your excess mana on making the Shivan Dragon stronger anyway, so it's quite true to its original in that regard. And the only reason that you wouldn't really is to bait out removal from your opponent, but there's no such thing as instant speed removal in Hearthstone anyway, so I think this is a pretty interesting take on it. If anyone has any ideas on how flying could be implemented in Hearthstone, one suggestion is that it would ignore taunts. I don't necessarily love that, but if you have any ideas, please do let me know in the comment section below. But let's kick off onto a different card. So moving on, let's take a look at a non-creature spell, and this one is from Magic the Gathering's black colour. We've got Fatal Push. This is the most modern card on the list, most recently printed, and also an all-star in the modern format for Magic the Gathering. If you're not aware, in Magic the Gathering there's a range of different formats. So it has a standard format just like Hearthstone, but then it also has a slightly older than that format called Modern, then a slightly older than that format called Legacy, and then a format where you can play basically anything called the Vintage. Now, Fatal Push is no longer in Standard, but it was in Standard quite recently, as of this recording. But in all of the older formats, Fatal Push does see quite a lot of play because it is absolutely fantastic. It removes most of the big threats in those formats, because in the older formats, threats tend to cost less mana, and Fatal Push is a really good way to kill them. Now, in Magic the Gathering, this card has something called Revolt. Revolt basically means if something that you control this turn has gone to the graveyard, then you get an additional ability, and in this case it makes Fatal Push be able to target things that have a mana cost of 4 or less instead of just 2 or less. That's really easy to do in Magic the Gathering. It's even easier in those older formats. You have these things called Fetchlands. These are lands that you play and then you sacrifice them to get a different land out of your deck. As a result, it's really easy to get the Revolt trigger on that, but that's a mechanic that doesn't quite translate over to Hearthstone, because in Hearthstone there's only sort of 2 or 3 permanents really. There's minions, there's weapons, and there's like heroes and quests. Heroes and quests don't die though, so that doesn't really make sense, and I felt like having this card trigger on your weapons breaking would be a little weird. I have put it in Rogue though, so maybe that makes more sense with the hero power and stuff, but it does make the wording on the card very clunky. Now, it's interesting to note that the wording for this card works almost exactly right, but the context of the card between Hearthstone and Magic the Gathering is so radically different. I think this card is usually weaker in Hearthstone. In Magic, because mana is harder to get, you don't just get an extra mana crystal at the start of each turn. You actually have to put lands into your deck that you then play to get mana. So because mana is harder to come by, 4 is actually like quite high for an amount of mana to pay for a real threat. Most of the threats that you're going to play in Magic the Gathering are going to cost 4 or less, with some exceptions. You know, there's still ramp decks in that game. But as a result, Fatal Push is going to kill most things. And because creatures in Magic the Gathering can't be directly attacked without the defender allowing it, little small creatures that have like incremental value are way better in Magic the Gathering than they are in Hearthstone. So as a result, Fatal Push is really good and really versatile in Magic the Gathering, but in Hearthstone, 4 mana is not really that much for a threat. You wouldn't usually be happy to spend your hard removal on a card that costs 2 or 3 mana, but at the same time, 1 mana hard removal is really hard to get. Obviously you've got Naturalize, but that one has a really heavy downside. But also in Hearthstone, having one of your own minions die is kind of it's a bigger ask, right? There's no such thing as Fetchlands. There's no things that you really want to be killing in Hearthstone, so it's actually a cost, I guess, to have one of your own creatures die. Overall, I think this card could warp the Standard and Wild formats a little bit in Hearthstone, and it has, you know, done just the same in Magic to some extent, but I don't think it would be massively unhealthy, although, however, I have put it in Rogue. It might be a bit too strong in Rogue, which already has some really good removal options like Vilespine Slayer, for example. So although it does feel like a Rogue card to me, maybe it would be more fair in a different class. Moving on from black, we have blue, and this card is Snapcaster Mage. This was the first card that got me thinking about this video idea, or this video series idea. And here it is. So Snapcaster Mage is a really simple card in Magic the Gathering. Basically, you play it, and its sort of battle cry ability, its end of the battlefield effect, we call it in Magic, allows you to choose a spell you've already cast this game that's in your graveyard, and you can cast it again until the end of the turn. Then it gets exiled, so you can't do it too many times in a row. So it's a pretty simple effect, incredibly versatile, incredibly strong on a 2-mana creature. Snapcaster Mage also has Flash in Magic the Gathering, which means that you can cast this on your opponent's turn. That makes it even more versatile. You can even just flash it in as a blocker. Sometimes people call it Ambush Viper mode, because Ambush Viper is another card that can also flash in as a 2/1. But again, Hearthstone doesn't really have instant speed stuff, and it's not the most iconic thing about this card, so I think it's fine. But I was fairly sure that when I put this card into the Hearthstone custom card maker that I'd set it to be a neutral epic, but it appears to have the mage background. That does make sense. I mean, it is Snapcaster Mage after all, but I wanted this to be a neutral epic, so that there would be enough room for every different class to mess around with it. Now, because there's no such thing as the graveyard in Hearthstone, this has to discover a spell you've cast this game, which I think is really interesting. And the way that I think this would work would, it would kind of add one of those ethereal copies to your hand, like when you cast Unstable Evolution or something, or an Echo card and you get that ethereal copy in your hand. I think that would be the best way to handle this effect. But if it were neutral, then this could do some really fun stuff in all of the different classes, really. In Mage, this could be used to cast extra Fireballs or Frostbolt to get that extra bit of burn. Similarly for Shaman, Shaman could get some lightning bolts, lava bursts, stuff like that. You could even have you know, something really crazy like Bran or Spirit of the Shark on the board. I think it's a really fun effect. I don't think it would necessarily unbalance the game, especially with the Discover clause there. Means you can't take too much advantage of it. Probably the biggest problem with it would be that it might become like an auto include in every single class, which wouldn't necessarily unbalance the game, but definitely warp the game around it. Still, I'd really love to see this effect or something more similar to it in Hearthstone. People love Discover. Spells are always fun. Why not? Why not let us discover spells and cast them? Next up is White, and I've cheated because I've actually chosen 2 cards from White because they're so similar and they're played in a lot of Magic's older formats. White is known for having some of the most powerful removal in Magic, and these are probably the 2 best examples of that. Now, I'd like you to be able to tell which one of these is much stronger. You should probably be able to tell Swords to Plowshares is way better than Path to Exile, but they're both pretty similar. Now, Path to Exile is what we'll talk about first. It's one of the most played cards in Magic the Gathering's modern format, the second most popular format of Magic. For 1 mana, you can remove just about any threat, absolutely anything basically, that your opponent has. Now, in Magic, this gives your opponent an extra land, so it gets them ahead on mana, which is a bit of a downside. It means you don't always want to be doing this, and you can port this over to Hearthstone in a really obvious way. Just give your opponent an extra mana crystal. That seems to work pretty nice. Again, a bit like Fatal Push, you know, you've got this 1 mana removal, but it has this quite big downside to offset it. I think this card would probably be weaker in Hearthstone, where tempo's so much more of a big deal a lot of the time, but still, like, I don't know, it's really strong, but my gut is telling me that in Hearthstone it wouldn't be as strong as it is in Magic, especially because in Hearthstone you can just attack your opponent's creatures rather than needing to use 1 mana removal spells. Now, the biggest difference between Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone for both of these cards is actually in the name of Path to Exile. It's the Exile Zone. So in Magic the Gathering you have the graveyard, and quite often the graveyard can be used as a resource. Black is particularly well known for making use of cards that are in the graveyard, pulling them back out, maybe bringing them, reanimating them back onto the board, or bringing them back to your hand or something like that. But there's also another zone called the Exile Zone. When you put something in the Exile Zone, chances are it's never coming back. It's very difficult to come back from the Exile Zone. It doesn't work in Hearthstone, where there's no such thing as a graveyard, so there can't be any such thing as a super duper graveyard, I guess. Although it would be a really interesting effect to kind of be able to put something into like this zone where it can't come back from, like you know, with Big Priest back in the day, especially when Big Priest was bouncing on turn 4, a lot of people wanted you to somehow exile things that they couldn't be reanimated, and that could be interesting. But the biggest effect that that has is that Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares in Magic the Gathering, when they exile things, that means that their dies trigger doesn't work. So basically, this could be used if I'd ported it over with the exile mechanic on it. Death rattles wouldn't trigger, essentially. So I suppose one thing you could do is say silence and then destroy target creature. I guess that works, but you know, I thought maybe that would make it too powerful. We best just leave it to destroy for a 1 mana removal spell. Now, if we look at Swords to Plowshares, clearly just better than Path to Exile, really. Very similar effect, but the downside instead is that its owner gains health. You almost always want to give the owner health rather than an extra land. Although, again, another interesting difference here, because Hearthstone caps out at 10 mana, whereas in Magic you don't cap out on mana until you run out of lands in your deck. So and that is often way higher than 10. It's usually about 23 to 24. But yeah, Swords to Plowshare is definitely stronger. I just thought these two effects were so similar, it wasn't really worth separating them out. Last but not least, we have Thragtusk, called the Polarizer by Ristic Studies. Fantastic documentary video on Thragtusk. If you're interested in Magic the Gathering documentaries, definitely check out Ristic Studies. But for such an iconic card in Magic the Gathering, this translates really well into Hearthstone. So much so, in fact, that it's almost a little boring, to be honest, to you. It's another card that has, to some extent, fallen victim to the changed combat system. So this card's way more powerful in Magic, where you get to swing in and decide what you want to do with your Thragtusk, whereas in Hearthstone, obviously, you would just drop this, and then someone would just ram their creature into it, and your Thragtusk's dead. It is still pretty powerful, though. I would compare it to Ken Bloodhoof. That is an 8/10 for 6. This is like an 8/6 for 5. But with that extra Battlecry ability thrown in, you get that extra 5 health. I think that's pretty neat. The end result is you get creature more resistant to silence, but overall maybe a little bit weaker. That said, Ken has not really been played in any standard decks since N'Zoth was in standard, so maybe having the stats redistributed and putting that little bit of extra life gain on, that makes it better to aggro and tempo decks, and bring down the cost by 1. Maybe that could be enough to make Thragtusk a playable card in Hearthstone, whereas, you know, Ken really isn't. Overall though, it's not going to be the Polarizer in Hearthstone. So thank you very much for watching. That was one card from each colour of Magic the Gathering, ported over to Hearthstone, with the exception of white, where I cheated and snuck in 2 there. Please let me know what you thought of this video. I thought it'd be an interesting, different take on the custom Hearthstone card series. I've got more ideas for cards. I've already made some of them. I've got talking points ready. So let me know if you like this video, if you'd like to see more Magic the Gathering cards ported over to Hearthstone. Have a wonderful day. Subscribe if you'd like to see more. Thumbs up the video, all that good stuff. You know how it works, I'm sure. Check out some other videos while you're here. Why not? Do it. But as I say, that is all from me. Until next time, have a wonderful day.